So we're going to start with the next panel. Will, you going to do intros?
Yes.
Yep. And thank everybody for being here still. Thank you for attending. All right, we'll take it.
All right. Well, thank you all so much for being here with us today. Excited about this next panel on racial equity and valuation. My name is Will Bradshaw. I am a professor of practice here in the Tulane School of Architecture, teaching in the real estate development program. Really excited about all three panelists that are here with us today. These are all folks that I have personal connections to and all really experts in this space. So really, really pleased that they could all join us. We're going to start by, similar to the last panel, I'll give brief introductions to each panelist, and then we'll get into some conversation and then open for questions towards the end. But Dr. Ed Coulson here in the middle is the director of the Center for Real Estate at the University of California, Irvine, where he's also a professor of economics and public policy in the School of Business, where he's been since 2017. Prior to his time at UCI, he was at UNLV for 2 years, and prior to that, he spent 30 years at Penn State University as a professor of economics, a professor of real estate economics, and the King Faculty Fellow in real estate. While he was at Penn State, he was also a mentor to my mentor, Dr. Lynn Fisher, who sends her regards to all of us, especially to you, Ed. And so he's not only among the nation's most respected scholars in real estate valuation, but it's really an honor for me to have this opportunity to introduce him, and I'm grateful that he could be with us today. Dr. Andre Perry, who is closest to me, is a senior fellow at Brookings Metro. He's a scholar in residence at American University and a professor of practice at Washington University. He's a nationally known and respected scholar and commentator on issues of race, education, economic opportunity, and related topics, and his work has been featured on MSNBC, The Root, PBS, NPR, The New York Times, and so many more media outlets. He's the author of Know Your Price, Valuing Black Lives and Property in America's Black Cities, and the Devaluation of Assets in Black Neighborhoods, which we will discuss substantially today. But prior to that, he was among a group of reformers, advocates, dreamers, and heroes that leaned into a broken New Orleans in 2005 and helped rebuild a fairer and better educational system in this city after that tragic summer. My family, and especially my kids, are grateful to him for those efforts, and I couldn't be happier that he's with us today either. I've been trying to figure out how I'd say that without crying for a week, so I failed. Sorry about that. Charu Singh is the founder and CEO of Just Value, Inc., a public benefit prop tech company developing a financial solution to address systemic race-based undervaluation and undercapitalization in communities of color. Just Value is the winner of the Ashoka Brookings Challenge, valuing homes in black communities, where they were one of 10 proposals selected from 54 applicants. Charu is also a research fellow in Harvard University's Graduate School of Design, and prior to starting Just Value, she was a managing director at Emergent Capital Partners, where she raised and deployed real estate capital investments into international markets. But prior to that, we were both graduate students at MIT at the same time. It was during this time that she called me one day out of the blue and asked to meet because she had heard that she was my doppelganger. I guess we have the same nose. But
I determined from afar.
that guy over there, he looks like me.
Hours of observation have never spoken with you.
Yes, but we've been friends ever since, and I'm really pleased to have her here and to have a front row seat on her efforts at Just Value. So with that, I will ask the first question, which is not a question at all, but actually just a request. If each of you could take 5 minutes and describe your work generally and how it relates to this topic today.
Well, my work with... Hello? Can you hear me? Yep. Great. My work with Just Value, it really picks up where big thinkers like Andre and Ed leave off. We take academic academic findings and make them actionable for the marketplace. And the way that we're doing that with undervaluation is through calculating undervaluation at the home level, through our restorative valuation model, making that additional home equity accessible to homeowners through a small dollar second loan product for home renovation called the restorative loan, and then working with lenders to integrate this approach into their methods and processes so that it can be embedded in the financial system over time.
Well, I'll go ahead. Andre Perry, Senior Fellow at the Brookings Institution, and most of folks in this room probably know me through the devaluation of assets in Black communities. But where the work really came from is through my team's effort to calculate the value of all assets, not just homes, all assets in Black communities. We often have a lot of anecdotal evidence around individual racism. What I try to do is to show the structures that extract value at a systemic level. And it's easier to see that when you essentially try to capture an asset in a majority Black place, comparing it to similar assets in similar social circumstances. So while I'm certainly here with a bunch of housers, and I love you all, my real goal is to identify structural racism. Because ultimately it extracts wealth opportunity, we can talk about that later, in so many different ways. It's just that in housing, it is very clear. We have a lot more evidence than in a lot other areas, and so that's where I started.
Yeah, first of all, it's a great pleasure to be on a panel with these two individuals because as professors we talk the talk, and we're very good at that, but these people are actually walking the walk, and I'm very pleased to be in conversation with them. It's awesome. I've been my research teams and I have been studying appraisers for 4 or 5 years. And this is not a subject that has been of much attention in the academic world. And so we started with some other projects, but we eventually came to this question about whether or not property appraisals in the residential space are racially differentiated. And so we have gathered two data sets, two humongous data sets, one of which I can't talk about yet because the FHA is being very snobby about releasing data before they're ready. But the other one comes from a large sample of mortgage applications during the subprime boom. And these are mostly subprime loans, actually. And we take a hard look at the difference between trying to make apples to apples comparisons of property judged by, or appraised by appraisers of different races with borrowers of different races. And I should note that these are all refi loans because that's where we see during the subprime crisis, there wasn't a lot of racial differentiation in mortgage approvals for purchases because everybody, banks wanted everybody to be buying homes and get mortgages. But in the refi space, there's great potential for racial bias. And what we find is that making an apples to apples comparison of the house, that Black borrowers' refi values were 4% less than comparable white borrowers. And actually, Hispanic and Asian borrowers also had lower property appraisals than white borrowers. What's interesting, and I think it speaks to the systemic aspect of this, is that this did not depend very much on the race of the appraiser, that white, Black, Asian, Hispanic appraisers discounted minority-owned property by almost the same amount. And so it speaks to the process of appraisal as much as anything else.
Thank you. So that's a great kind of lead in to the next question that I have, which, among the folks on this panel, including myself, there's sort of an agreement that predominantly minority neighborhoods, especially predominantly Black neighborhoods, experience a reduction in home values that you can't explain by home characteristic, by location, access to amenities, et cetera, what we, among the four of us and in the wider world, refer to as racial bias in home valuation. But we also live in this moment of like divergent facts, right? Where we just don't believe the same thing, even when presented with the same information. And there may be folks in the audience that are skeptical of the basic premise of this discussion, right? Like this is just not a thing. So I want to start by asking you to address this like straw man person that believes that this is not a thing. What do you say to that person?
Well, I'll start. You know, part of our job, Jenny Schutz is here from Brookings, but we are charged with producing facts that will incite action. When we released the report, The Valuation of Assets in Black Communities, Jonathan Rothwell, David Harshbarger, and I, we knew we had a hit because when we ran the numbers, we said, man, this is a large number. We found it, the difference was 23% difference, about 48,000 per home. Cumulatively, we found about 156 billion in lost equity. And, you know, we ran it, we shipped it off to a couple colleagues in different universities. They liked our methods, and we consistently found that number. Now, I had to present in front of the Financial Services Committee for the House, and I presented with the head of, or alongside the head of the Appraisal Foundation, the head of the Appraisal Institute, a major another appraisal organization. So essentially the governance structure, if you will, if you want to say there's a governance structure around appraisers. And Representative Al Green asked us a very basic question. Do we feel that there's discrimination in appraising? And he just, in a very broad stroke. And he asked us by show of hands if we believe there's discrimination. And I was the only one that raised their hand, right? And it looked crazy. It looked crazy. And it looks crazy because for most of American history, it was legal to discriminate against Black people. Many of the tools that are currently used today were used to thwart Black people from purchasing in certain areas. Appraising practices were some of those tools. So for me, I thought everybody would raise their hand. And then he asked us another question, if we feel that they're not discriminated against Black communities, kindly raise your hand. And all the appraisers raised their hands. Now, afterwards, this is where I want to get to this. Afterwards, all the appraisers surrounded me and they said, I'm not doing anything wrong. I didn't break the law. And I said, yes, that is the problem. That many of the practices are infused with this intrinsic value of whiteness, and we might talk about that a little bit later, that we just assume these neighborhoods are worse off. We assume that whenever we see Black people congregated in a space, something is wrong. And so for my work, when I confront people on this, I have to come to grips that we've all been infected with this narrative. And it's going to take years of data, of truth-telling, of anecdotal data. A lot of the reports on people whitewashing their homes, removing all the Black artifacts, getting a second appraisal, coming in hundreds of thousands of dollars. We're going to need that over time. Because right now, it is so ingrained in our psyche that Black neighborhoods and in many cases, homes owned by Black people are worth less. And so for me, you can't convince somebody right away. It's about creating a new narrative that shifts hearts and minds over time.
Sure.
Well, that was great. Andre. It's great to be here with you guys.
Really is.
You know what? I've been addressing that straw man my whole life, and sometimes it's a real man. Often it's a white man, but not always. So, I think I prefer actually at this stage of my life to be working on this solution, to engage with the people who do believe in this problem, because guess what? Believing in that problem, saying yes, this problem exists, is only the first yes of like a dozen important yeses that you need to get to actually build and deploy a solution. So understanding that we have a problem is actually the easiest step. All the data is out there. We can continue to do this research, but just on this stage, there's sufficient research to prove the point. And there's a lot of other research that's not represented here right now. The next step the next yes that's very hard to get is, do you believe we can solve this problem? And that is actually really hard because there's lots of people who believe that this problem exists, but do not believe it can be solved. And frankly, I was one of those people not that long ago. So, I think that we have a long way to go in terms of engaging people who actually believe this problem exists, want to solve it, and want to get engaged, but there's actually no pathway to really doing that using the tools we have available today in the marketplace. And that's really, where I choose to spend my time today. And I believe through those years of work that are in front of us, that slowly we will start to move the needle on our national psyche of understanding how value is allocated. I'll just say one more thing. About 3 years ago, when I started working on this solution, or this idea, and then I found Andre's paper and was just felt so affirmed and so excited that research had been done. And I was I would talk to everybody about this concept. And I just received blank faces. People really didn't understand what systemic undervaluation could be. Lots of black and brown folks did. But they also believed that those home values could not be raised unless their neighborhoods gentrified. Today, when I'm talking with people across industries, across roles, I see a lot more common understanding about what that problem is and an interest in engaging with it. I think we are still a long ways away from implementing robust solutions that can deliver wealth to homeowners, but I think that pool of people who are actually, who believe in this problem are ready to be engaged, and those are who we should be talking to.
See, I have a completely different answer to this question because I don't walk the walk, but I do talk the talk. And I would say to people who don't believe this, we get this differential. We see this differential. It's statistically significant. Why do you think we're making a mistake? And they would have a response. And I say, we took care of that. Read the paper. Oh, but you didn't think of this other thing. Well, we took care of that too. It's economics papers have become very, very strict about when and how we can infer causality. Being black causes the appraisal to be lower. And we spend 50 pages going through all the possible objections because that's what we do. And at the end of the day, we get this number. And in some sense, it's an average number, right? It's the average. So some appraisers are better, some appraisers are worse. We don't find a lot of cases, obviously, where we get these headline numbers of a $200,000 difference. If that were more pervasive, we would have probably tried to deal with this problem a long time ago. It's more subtle than that. It's not the case that it's a few bad apples. It's a systemic problem that on average we get this, as I say, 4% differential. And 4% sounds small, but if you are a borrower and you're trying to refi in order to get cash out to do something good with it, it's money. And so 4% of I'm trying to think of an average, I'm from California, so average house value, $800,000, but maybe that's not the right number to use. So a $400,000 house, 4% of $400,000, $16,000, 80% LTV, so $12,000. That's $12,000. That's not nothing. That can be a life-changing amount of cash at the right time. So it's an important, even though it sounds small, it's an important, it's an economically important number.
And it's one, we might talk about this later, but when we first released the report in 2018, we've always said that the value gap is not just appraising. I said that from the start, but because appraisers are explicitly charged with pricing, everyone looked to them, right? But we were begging at the time, when I first started going into this area, naturally, researchers just look for a data set just to go to. I was like, let's go to it. And there wasn't a data set to go to.
Yeah.
And that's initially was a problem for me. Then it was like, okay, what proxies could we use? And so we used Zillow, Redfin, census data, and other things. But what was amazing about that is that you could see people becoming so defensive. And we did not say an appraiser, we did not say lenders, and eventually we did get more appraisal data to talk about the variation. But right off the top, lenders became just like, we don't have anything to do with it. Appraisers, we don't have anything to do with it. It's all demand. It's all supply. It's something, and I was like, clearly there's something here. We see race. Somebody has something to do with this. And we should talk about the appraisal data, but there are many other factors that are involved in this value gap that we need to explore. So, but for me, it was a strategy to then say, if we can knock down this one domino of appraisers, then we can get to lenders. We could possibly get to underwriting. We can maybe get to insurance in some cases. There are a lot of other dominoes to fall, but appraising is one of those things that people we just don't pay attention to. But it is such an important factor in all of housing discrimination.
So I want to pick up on that and kind of echo back to something that Ed said in his opening comments and kind of do it using really the opening to the devaluation of assets in black neighborhoods. Andre, were you open with this story about a longtime faculty member and an administrator at the University of Mississippi sending out like a social media post about how the university really needs to rein in the problem of black women walking in public before Oxford's property values just plummet. And you're clearly making the point here that explicit racism is at the core of the issue, right? That it's the thing that makes for marginalized groups, there's a starting point of explicit racism. But Ed, part of what you've talked about in your paper is that the race of the appraiser actually doesn't really matter for determining these valuation differences. And so I want to pick up on that discussion a little bit. And there's especially been a lot of policy work to try to expand the racial diversity of appraisers, right? And is that the right direction to go in? That represents both a step forward, but also maybe not. And so how do you think about that kind of policy strategy associated with appraiser diversity and this problem?
Well, my interest in moving marginalized young people into their roles in our economy are really focused on where is growth happening in our economy. What are the roles that are going to be really resilient over their lifetime? And I just don't believe the human-led appraisal is where the future of valuation will be over time. In its heyday, it was hard to make a really great income as an appraiser. I think there was a period of time where it was a good job, but really, I would never want to put a black or brown person into a role where they have no agency, and that really is the role of the appraiser. They have a freelance role that's highly dependent on relationships, and that means they have very little power, and that's why you see so much of these challenges of appraisers appraising to the sales contract. And actually, it's a great reason to do research around refi rates, around refi prices, because there's no comp for refis. And so you see a big discrepancy there that you don't typically see in actual transactions. So, my interest is I think it's great to have more black and brown people entering valuation, but I would really focus on all the tech-enabled places that valuation is occurring. So as a data-based company, I would love to see we need people who are skilled in managing algorithmic and AI models, testing them, monitoring them, building them. Those are widely transferable skills across the market, whether you want to stay in real estate or valuation or beyond. And that's where I would love to see a lot more effort. It's also a lot harder. There's education gaps you need to overcome, and it's not a well-defined role yet. Our economy and our valuation approaches are evolving, and we need to figure out how those roles emerge. So at minimum, I would like to see as much focus in diversifying our tech industry and data industries.
Can I speak to a couple of those points? One, yes, obviously diversifying the appraiser population is a really good thing, but as I said before, it's something about the process of appraisal that causes these problems in general. One of the interesting outcomes of the study that we did is that you have to, because it's refis are advantageous to look at in this context because you're actually seeing the borrower. Whereas in a purchase mortgage, you're not actually seeing the borrower. You're seeing the home seller. It's a different thing going on there. But because it's a refi, as you said, there's no anchor. There's no sale price attached to that. And the banks, isn't telling the appraiser this is what the appraisal is going to be, like they would in a purchase mortgage. And just as a side note, one of the earlier studies we did on appraisal was to study whether or not market pressures caused appraisers to do the bank's bidding more often, and there was definitely a connection there. And now I've lost my train of thought completely. Because there's no sale price, we have to anchor the appraisal to something, and what we do is we use the Fannie Mae's automated valuation model. The problem with that is that turns out to have a racial bias as well.
It does.
There's about a 1% racial bias against black-owned property in the AVMs. And so when we anchor it to the AVM, we get one number, but when we anchor the projection of the AVM onto the sale price, we use a different sample for that. That bumps it up from a 3% differential for black households to a 4% differential for black households. So while I think machine learning models for this process are coming, I think they need a lot more training than they're getting in order to fairly price. What I'm saying is that black households paid more for their housing than white households. That's a paradox about all of this, is because presumably because, I don't know why, but maybe it's because black households are more constrained in the supply that they're kind of in some sense allowed to buy. They end up paying a premium. And so we have to, that's yet another problem we have to deal with. I mean, this is not about black and white neighborhoods, it's about black and white individual homeowners, and the black homeowners are in some sense kind of forced, I don't know if that's the right word, but they're paying a premium for apples to apples comparable houses.
The only thing I can add is this is an area I get into the biggest arguments with progressives on this issue, because there's this wanting to believe that the race of the appraiser has the most impact on the valuation. And it's just not there. I mean, it certainly is a workforce issue. I think we all can agree. We want to see non-discrimination in the workforce, and there is discrimination in appraising. 90% of appraisers are white, 75% are male. It is a white male-dominated thing for a reason. So we do need to open up opportunities in every field, and in the future, it should be directed towards more software development and that. But I say this all the time, the price comparison model, where you compare one home to another to establish some kind of average price, it is fraught largely because if you do that, if you compare a few homes to another in an area that's been discriminated against, you just effectively recycle discrimination over and over again. And we see that being played out, regardless if you're a black appraiser, a brown appraiser, or a white appraiser. You see certain parts of, and I know this, a reason why I got into a lot of this is my experience in New Orleans, where I owned a home on the West Bank where on one side of a certain street, homes were like $50,000, $60,000, and they're exact same homes, the exact same. And I would go, wow, what is going on? And I was in education, as you mentioned, and at the time I was trying to just figure out school financing issues. And between appraising being whacked and tax assessments being whacked, I was like, I just could not understand where we're basing these numbers off of. So I say all that to say that when we're talking about this issue, there is a workforce issue. And I do applaud the Biden administration. I have to say that they took our reports and they created the Property Appraisal Valuation Equity Task Force, but it's focused on appraisers, not appraising. And that has to shift. It has to shift if we're going to get control of this issue.
So I want to pick up on that and kind of go back to some of the data questions that we were talking about. We talked in our discussion before this panel about appraisal data and the Federal Housing Finance Administration releasing new appraisal data, which has a really positive impact for teasing out some of the questions that you couldn't get at with the initial data sets you've used. But then there are also these shortcomings with that data, and those shortcomings in some ways reflect problems in the whole industry. So can you all talk about some of that a little bit as well?
Yeah, the original study that we did, the data set we got was actually the mortgage database for a particular subprime lender called New Century, who they were sued for something. And as part of the judicial process, they released to the public their entire mortgage database, and it had all the valuation stuff, and it had the name of the appraiser, and it had some information on the comps. And from that, we were able to tease out this idea that the race of the appraiser was if not irrelevant, at least much less than people might have otherwise thought. What we didn't have, but what the FHA, so I'm confused because we spent a year trying to talk the FHA into giving us access to their data, and now you're telling me the FHFA.
Sorry, I may be adding an F unnecessarily. I confused my agencies.
That data's there, but we had to run through a lot of hoops in order to get some contemporary data on this process. What they don't always have, and I think this is really important, is the adjustments that appraisers make when trying to create an apples-to-apples comparison. As you probably know, what appraisers do is they see the property, they go out and find three comparable properties, and there's always a question of how comparable these properties are, of course. That's a whole separate issue. But once they find comparable properties, they actually have to make adjustments to the comp valuations in order to account for the differences between the comp property and the subject property. And one of the differences that they almost always have to make is the differences in neighborhoods. The comps come from, the normal procedure is to get comps from the same development, but that's not always available. And so they have to get comps from different neighborhoods. And then there's an adjustment to the price. And what adjustment, where do they get the number that properly adjusts the price of a house in one neighborhood to the price of another neighborhood? Where does that number come from? And it comes from out of their ear.
That's right.
I was going to name another body part, but that's where it comes from. And, it's the appraiser's knowledge and judgment and blah,
It's
blah,
called the
blah.
gut.
But basically, it's a number that we don't know where it comes from. We do not have that information. Not even in the best databases do we see all the adjustments that are made. And so that would be the gold standard for data as far as I'm concerned.
Well, I can't add anything more to that except for it was, meeting after meeting with FHFA. This is one of those areas where there's a treasure trove of data out there that should be public. You're like, why isn't this public? And I had probably at least 12 meetings with various administrators just because at the time, we were getting attacked by the appraisal industry. And I said, well, there's an easy way to figure this out. Give us the data, right? And so we were just going over and over. And there was just a reluctance to get this information. So for me, I think we can create databases that will answer a lot of questions. And it's not just in appraising. There's a lot of real estate information that people need to know about. But it really starts with transparency, some of this basic good governance structures. Transparency with the data is important because this is the other thing. You mentioned this. You mentioned that average indifference, national average, but you can really see it pop in certain parts of the country. There are some metro areas, and largely because appraising kind of works in networks. There are certain firms that are run by certain family members, literally like this uncle and this cousin have the firms, and they're racist. There's no way around that. It is, and so you see certain black neighborhoods across class. What we're finding is that low-income brown neighborhoods, you see devaluation. But it is clear that in some metro areas, it is a real problem. You can pinpoint the firms that are doing this. So and this is one of the other things I think we talk about when we talk about discrimination is mostly based on the individual discrimination. It's harder to make claims of discrimination for entire neighborhoods. And that's where I think a lot of this falls into. People are prejudging and valuing entire neighborhoods this way. And so, but we don't have the tools, the same kind of tools that we have for saying there's an individual appraiser that did something wrong. Well, but whoever appraises in these neighborhoods are hurting these neighborhoods.
I'll just add a couple things to that. One, I think that it's pretty clear that data is infrastructure now, and that this type of data is incredibly important infrastructure that needs to be more widely available. And without it, we will stymie all ecosystem player efforts to create a fair baseline within our housing industry. So it's just fundamental. And it has been very difficult to get to this point, and there's still lots of gatekeeping around the type of data that's actually necessary to make solutions. To that point, the reason these guys have had so many meetings with so many different data holders is that you cannot understand inequity using average and median figures at the tract level. You need to be able to have granular data that can be disaggregated for impact for specific groups. And that is not of it that when you look at the FHFA dashboard, it gives you a median for a tract. Well, everybody knows that the housing industry and market is so complicated that it's almost meaningless to have that number. Because of the diversity within that particular area, both demographically and in terms of housing stock. So I think that's, that has to be recognized. The aggregated data is not going to get us there in terms of understanding or solutions. The other thing we need to recognize is that large originators and large buyers have the benefit of really robust data sets. However, they may not have the motivation or the skill, frankly, to be able to interrogate those data sets for issues around inequity. And that means that people like the three of us who are really focused on addressing disparity, building wealth for people who've been left behind, are really not equipped with the same tools as the rest of the marketplaces. And then the last thing I'll say about data is that it is an endless conversation. Data and research, I'm sorry to say, I love it, I read it a lot, but we can be trapped in this conversation forever. And really, that is the reason I lean into action. It's not that Just Value has all the answers, and we will never have all the answers, but if we do not start taking action someplace, that we can endlessly have this conversation. And it is a known and effective tool to trapping the conversation around race too. And so it's not a very popular thing probably to say as a fintech company to say, well, the data doesn't matter. It does matter, but I do think that we need to move into a posture of testing and innovation and just trying things with unlikely partners so that we have some results that we can talk about and build from.
And just one comment on the potential value of a convening like this on the data side is that I think my friend Chris over here in the corner actually has a very helpful data set that y'all should talk to him about. So, way to go, Fed.
That's right. Sure. Can I just say?
Yeah, please.
We also need to be clear about the consequences of this stuff, because in many cases this is theft. I bring this up all the time. That difference in valuation between homes in black neighborhoods and white neighborhoods. It's 100. We calculate 163, but let's stick with that 2018 number, 156. $156 billion is the equivalent of 4 million black-owned businesses based upon the average amount black people use to start their firms. It would have paid for more than 8 million four-year degrees based upon the average amount of a four-year public education, replaced the pipes in Flint, Michigan 3,000 times over, covered nearly all of Hurricane Katrina damage. It's double the annual economic burden of the opioid crisis. It's a big number. One of the papers I'm working on now is to show all the different things that home equity is used for. And this stemmed from a conversation I had with somebody in Alabama who was going through IVF treatments. And I asked, how are you paying for this? Home equity. When you ask people who are running for mayor or whatever, how do they finance it? Home equity. If not, they're taking out a loan. Again, people pay for college. People start businesses. They move to a better neighborhood. So when we don't get this right, we are robbing people of the opportunity to increase economic mobility and well-being for themselves. And so it is a very important issue.
So I think I'm going to ask one more question that is a perfect lead into, which gets at kind of a very personal story for me and my family. But I've had this project I've been working on intermittently the last couple of years. It's a podcast called Property Lines that's really focused on real estate race and unequal opportunity in America. And one of the subjects is a family that refers to themselves as the Alabama Black Magrooters, Magruder with an MC. My wife is a Magruder with an MA, which is the common last name for the white side of the same family. They both descend from a Scotsman who came to Maryland in the 17th century, was a tobacco farmer. And over time, a part of the family moved to Alabama, where they became a miscegenated, if they weren't already a miscegenated, family of enslaved and owner. And one of those formerly enslaved people, a man named Charles Magruder, MC, was a carpenter and a breeder who was hired out to other plantation owners, both to build and fix buildings, but also to create more enslaved people. And after emancipation, Charles purchased property in what's now Greene County, Alabama. And he reached out to all the children that he could find and all the women with whom he had had those children, about 40 women and about 100 children. And he invited them to move back to this land and to farm it with him. And many of them did. And this extended family still owns this property and some other property that they purchased nearby several generations later. And when you talk to the family members about that land, they all see it as a touchstone for their wider success in the world. So for me, this story is this like very clear example of the value of real estate ownership and how tied in real estate ownership is to financial stability, both historically and in our present reality, right? And so what you're just saying, Andre, about really the theft of value and how that limits opportunity for people, given this history, given these sort of facts of things that occurred in our lives, in our communities, how do we get, like, what's the path look like to a better future? How do we get there? And particularly, are there like 3 or 4 concrete steps, like we should do this and then we should do that, you know, like it's maybe too hard a problem to put that way, but
What kind of question is that?
I get to ask the questions, you just can't answer them, Charu.
No, but I will say,
Yeah,
I have a general framework for that.
yeah,
In ways to restore value. You have to invest in people. You have to invest in people, invest in place, and divest from racism. The reason why I say you first have to invest in people, got to figure out ways to restore the value directly to people. Because there are a lot of strategies that ultimately invest in place through brick and mortar, through infrastructure investments. And you'll raise values, people can't keep pace, they're pushed out, they can't live there. And so for me, we got to figure out ways to give tax credits, microloans, CDFIs need to provide resources to directly to developers from the area, potential homeowners. You got to make investments in people. But you do need to invest in place because the problem of devaluation, you have less resources in place. So you do need to invest in place in brick and mortar and infrastructure, but it can't be at the expense of people. And then finally, you have to divest from racism, and what that means. Sorry, there you go. It's green now. And what that means is like around our current practices in appraising. We need new practices. We got to divest from these old ones that are not, that subjective portion of it. It just leads to googly gook. We need to firm that up. So for me, what is the harder part for us mentally is that we need to learn how to invest in black people, in potential homeowners. And that's just hard for us to think through. But we've done it throughout history. Well, I mean, it wasn't that long ago. I mean, even to a certain extent, PPP loans were the response, a government response to people hurting because we asked them, or government asked them to shut down their businesses, and we came with a program and initiative to respond. Well, there's been people who've been socially distanced for decades, generations, and we have yet to provide a response. We need a response. So for me, invest in people, invest in place, divest from racism.
Can I make two unrelated comments, and not even that related to those words, which were quite wise. First of all, your story brings to mind the fact that it's land that's important.
Mm-hmm.
Capital depreciates, land appreciates. And so I'm actually kind of skeptical of programs that provide ground leases and then provide home ownership to people with ownership of the capital. I mean, if you want to change the wealth structure, you're going to do much better by making sure people have land ownership as opposed to capital ownership. Second thing, and this is totally Pollyanna of me, I'm sure, but banks should welcome our discussion here because there's apparently value there that they're not taking advantage of. If you told a bank, look, you take this refi and you can add $12,000 to that loan, that's $12,000 of interest that they can get. And so, in some sense, why wouldn't they want to unlock that value? Maybe I'm, not thinking about that correctly, but it does seem that there's a wedge there that can be taken advantage of.
Well, I'm picking up what you're putting down.
Over here looking for the wedge.
I'm spending a lot of time and effort betting that banks are going to find an opportunity there, and we have to reorganize our understanding and conversation around risk and origination in order to do that. It's a big question you've asked, Will. And I'll just focus my answer on that. I think there is a lot of low-hanging fruit at the intersection of justice and market infrastructure. We have, just value is not doing anything new. Every old banker I talk to reminds me of some program that came up in the 70s or 80s that was somehow trying to address some of the fundamental problems that our solutions are addressing. Most of them have shied away from race specifically. And so I guess what I would say is we need to continue to open up this conversation around race, because I've seen a lot of growth in our understanding about race-based inequity very broadly throughout our market and in the housing system. And the more we understand, have facility with those issues, the better it is for building solutions off of that. And to continue to use this creative time to build solutions that feel like they are addressing a perceived and or real risk. So I think these are near-term efforts. I don't know how optimistic I am that we will find a long-standing, durable solution to racial inequity in the US. My family comes from India, where we had colonialism for centuries, and I look at any other colonial, post-colonial country has also not been reconciled or repaired for that inequity. So I think for me, it really is. I like what Andre said about focusing on people, which is a real. I think a real weakness in America. This is the richest country I've worked in. I've worked across the globe. And when I've worked in Indonesia and Vietnam, their people are highly treasured resources within their countries in ways that I don't see reflected here. And I think if we could shift our market understanding to wanting to invest in all the people in the US, that would help to unlock this feeling of race and value being aligned in the way that they are today.
We've got 2.5 minutes. Hoov, I'll turn it over to you to open for questions.
I'm going to give you a good, bad, good sandwich. Meaning, the good news is this was an excellent panel. I absolutely loved it. Bad news is we have no time for questions. However, the good news is we're going to have a 15-minute break, and you can ask them questions as we prepare for the next panel. But we want to stay on time. So I want to thank the panelists for their really great insights. And I want to invite you to ask them your questions on their time as we prepare for the next panel. Thanks, everybody.